The words struck like a whip, sharp enough to make the air tremble in the sterile ward of St. Vincent's Hospital. That child isn't mine. Cold, clipped, designed to wound. Ezra Kane's voice carried the weight of command, as if every syllable had been honed on the battlefield he had once ruled as a decorated officer. His broad shoulders, wrapped in a military coat still heavy with medals, blocked the doorway. Authority clung to him even now, but so did arrogance. Leona Hart sat upright on the narrow bed, arms curled around her newborn, as though her body alone could shield him from the world's contempt. She had delivered only hours before, yet the bruises beneath her eyes were not from the labor. They were older, deeper, the kind that come from being doubted too many times. She held her silence as Ezra's words ricocheted across the room, her lips pressed into a bloodless line. Her body curled slightly forward, protective, as though her son were a flame she dared not let the wind touch. "I came here to end this once and for all," Ezra continued, pacing like a soldier waiting for orders. "I wanted to see with my own eyes what scheme you've conjured this time. And what do I find? A nurse from a forgotten neighborhood clinging to a fantasy." His words drew glances. Visitors, staff, even patients shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Yet none stepped forward. None challenged the man in uniform who wielded rank like a blade. Whispers began to ripple, sharp and sour, curdling the air. Leona lowered her gaze to her son. He stirred against her chest, a soft whimper escaping his lips. She turned him gently, so his small face caught the morning light. Ezra's steps faltered. For a moment his breath caught in his throat. The child's eyes, not yet fully open, gleamed with a storm-gray hue, a rare inheritance, etched into the Kane bloodline for generations. Ezra's own eyes mirrored the same unsettled shade, a family signature that could not be mistaken. A hesitation, fleeting but visible, crossed his stern features. His hand twitched against the edge of his coat. Recognition flickered, uninvited, undeniable. But then it vanished as quickly as it had come. He hardened, shaking his head as though dismissing a hallucination. "Coincidence," he muttered. "Genetics are a lottery. That doesn't mean a thing." The ward seemed to still. Even the machines paused in their beeping. Leona inhaled shakily, catching the fracture in his denial, the crack he tried so desperately to seal. A tear slipped down her cheek, though her voice remained steady. "You saw it. You know what you saw." He scoffed, deflecting. "I see desperation. You think parading a child in front of me will change what's already true. You're after my name, my pension, my honor, but you'll get nothing." Gasps fluttered among the onlookers, the shame spreading like wildfire. Some shook their heads, already convinced of her deceit. Others leaned closer, eager for spectacle. Leona felt every gaze pierce her skin, every whisper strip another layer of dignity. She did not argue. She only kissed her son's forehead, her tears wetting his fragile hair. Her silence infuriated Ezra more than any accusation. He leaned closer, voice low but venomous. "You're not just a liar, Leona. You're delusional. I gave you kindness once, and this is how you repay me? By trying to chain me with a burden that isn't mine?" The room held its breath. No one interrupted. Authority was a shield too heavy for strangers to lift. Leona closed her eyes. Her mind retreated, as if to escape the moment. She saw the past unspool before her, the night of the military banquet when Ezra, flushed with drink and bitterness, had called her into the quiet back hall. She remembered the trembling of his hands as he spoke of loneliness, the false gentleness in his voice when he whispered that she was different, that she was safe. She remembered how his eyes had softened in ways she had never seen before or since, and she remembered how silence became her prison afterward, how her confession of pregnancy was met with a check folded into her palm, crisp and cruel. Now here they were, 9 months later, the child real, undeniable, breathing in her arms, and Ezra, still waging war with denial. "Leave," she said finally. Her voice carried no tremor, only exhaustion carved into steel. "If you have no heart left in you, then go. I won't beg." Ezra froze, the command reversing in his chest. For a second, the iron discipline faltered. He looked down at the infant again. Those storm-gray eyes blinked open, meeting his with startling clarity. It was as though the child himself stared into the hollow he had built, daring him to deny what was carved in blood. Ezra swallowed hard, then tore his gaze away. Without another word, he turned and strode to the door. For a moment, just before stepping out, he glanced back. At Leona. At the child. His jaw clenched as if fighting a battle within. Then the door closed, leaving silence heavy as stone. Leona bent forward and sobbed into her son's small body, rocking him as if her movement alone could shield him from cruelty. "You are not shame," she whispered through tears. "You are my reason." Outside, Ezra stood beneath the hospital awning. Rain began to fall, soft and unrelenting. From his pocket he pulled the crumpled check he had once given her, a relic of his denial. For a long moment he stared at it, the paper dampening under the drizzle. Then, with a growl low in his throat, he tore it in half. The pieces scattered on the wet pavement like fallen metals. He lifted his head to the gray sky, but the storm was no longer above him. It churned inside, quiet and merciless. And back inside, Leona pressed her lips against her son's temple. The world saw a scandal, a lie, a question. She saw only truth wrapped in fragile skin and tiny fists. The truth he could not escape, no matter how hard he tried. Rain hammered the city through the night, washing the streets in silver streaks. By the time Leona left St. Vincent's the following morning, the storm had eased into drizzle. She carried her son swaddled close, each step down the hospital stairs deliberate, careful, as though the weight of her child could anchor her against the tide of stairs that followed. People looked at her differently now, some with pity, others with suspicion, most with indifference. The city had a way of swallowing stories whole. One moment they were headlines, the next just whispers caught in the rain. Yet Leona felt every glance, every murmur pressed into her like fingerprints she could not scrub away. She pulled her coat tighter, adjusted the baby against her chest, and kept walking. Her apartment on the east side was nothing more than 2 rooms stacked on top of each other, the wallpaper peeling, the ceiling fan a slow, creaking sentinel. But it was shelter. She placed her son, Elias, she whispered his name again, testing how it sounded in the air, into the borrowed crib by the window. His tiny chest rose and fell steadily. Storm-gray eyes flickered open, then shut. Leona sat at the small wooden table with a chipped mug of tea. Across from her lay the folded remnants of the check Ezra had once thrown at her. She had carried it in her bag for months, untouched, a reminder of what she refused to accept. Now it was gone, torn in two beneath the rain. Still, the insult clung like smoke. The knock came soft at first, then firmer. She rose, wary, and opened the door to find Marisol Vega standing there with a pot of chicken stew balanced on her hip. The older woman, a widow from the next apartment, stepped inside without waiting for permission. Her accent carried warmth, her eyes sharper than her years. "You need to eat," Marisol said, setting the pot on the stove. She studied Leona's tired face, the dark crescents under her eyes. "He came, didn't he?" Leona lowered her gaze. "He came. He left." Marisol's lips tightened. "Men like him think silence makes them untouchable. But silence can also bury them. Don't forget that." Leona said nothing. She lifted Elias from the crib, pressing her cheek to his soft head. How do I raise him? She whispered, knowing his father denied him before the world. Marisol ladled stew into a bowl and set it gently on the table. You raise him by never denying him yourself. That's all the truth a child needs. The words settled into Leona's chest like a stone, heavy yet steadying. She sat down and ate in silence, the warmth of the broth loosening a knot she hadn't realized had formed in her throat. That night, long after Marisol left, Leona opened a notebook she had hidden under her mattress. She had been writing letters since the day she learned she was pregnant. Words Elias would one day read, so he would never wonder who he was. She wrote slowly, the pen trembling in her hand. Your father stood in front of me and called me a liar. He looked at you and tried to erase you. But I saw him falter. I saw him see you. He will deny it until his dying breath, perhaps. But I will never deny you. You are mine, and that is enough. She closed the notebook and placed it back beneath the mattress, then kissed Elias's brow. He stirred, sighed, and drifted deeper into sleep. Across the city, Ezra sat alone in his apartment, his uniform jacket hanging heavy on the back of a chair. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, but when he lifted it to his lips, he couldn't swallow. The image of the child's eyes burned too vividly. His father's voice rose in memory, sharp and merciless. Never show weakness, boy. Weakness makes you prey. Ezra slammed the glass down, the liquid sloshing across the table. For once, he did not drink. The following morning, Leona returned to her part-time job at the corner diner. The neon sign flickered as she tied her apron and stepped into the rush of clattering dishes and murmured conversations. She moved with practiced efficiency, refilling coffee cups, balancing trays. But the whispers followed her here too. Two men in the corner booth spoke too loudly. You hear about Kane's little scandal? Nurse from the East Side claiming he fathered her kid. Pathetic, the other muttered. Always someone looking for a payout. Leona froze for half a second before forcing herself to move again. She placed plates in front of them, her hands steady though her stomach twisted. She said nothing. She couldn't. To fight back would only feed their narrative. By the end of the shift, her feet ached, her back throbbed, but she kept her head high. As she walked home in the fading light, Elias bundled against her chest. She whispered promises to him. They'll call me a liar. They'll call you worse. But one day, they'll see. Truth can't stay buried forever. Back in her apartment, she placed him in the crib and sat in the chair beside it. She hummed a lullaby her mother once sang, a melody soft enough to blur the noise of the city outside. Elias blinked up at her with storm-gray eyes that caught the glow of the streetlight. She smiled through her tears. You are not a mistake, she whispered. You are my truth. Far across town, Ezra stood by his window. The city sprawled beneath him like a battlefield. He told himself he was untouchable, that Leona's silence would protect him as it always had. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw were storm-gray eyes staring back, unyielding. And somewhere in that silence, doubt began to whisper. By March, the air carried the metallic scent of thawing snow, the city shedding winter in ragged patches of slush. The world kept moving, but inside Leona's small apartment, time bent itself around Elias's breathing, his cries, his small fists reaching for light. Each day was a rhythm of survival, feedings, shifts at the diner, letters written in the hush of night. Yet something inside her, though bruised, began to steady. On the first Sunday of the month, she dressed Elias in a borrowed blanket and walked 3 blocks to the old brick church on the corner. She hadn't set foot inside a sanctuary in years, but her chest ached for refuge, for words stronger than whispers. The congregation was modest. Elderly women in wide-brimmed hats, children fidgeting in pews, a choir humming gospel that rose like sunlight through stained glass. Leona slipped into the back row, rocking Elias gently as the pastor spoke. She kept her eyes low, her presence small. When the service ended and neighbors exchanged greetings, a tall woman approached her. She wore a simple gray coat, her hair streaked with silver, her gaze sharp but kind. "You're Leona Hart," she said, not as a question, but as recognition. Leona stiffened. "Do I know you?" "Not yet," the woman replied. She offered her hand. "I'm Ruth Johnson. I run the food pantry a few blocks down. I've heard your story." Leona braced for judgment, but Ruth's eyes softened as she glanced at Elias, who blinked curiously from his blanket. "He's got eyes like a storm rolling in," Ruth murmured. "Rare, strong, not the kind you can deny." Leona swallowed hard. She wanted to believe the words meant something, but doubt had worn grooves into her soul. "People say I'm lying," she whispered. "That I made this up." Ruth's expression hardened, a weathered strength carved from years of fighting unseen battles. "Let them talk. The truth doesn't need their permission. The truth stands, even when men with medals try to bury it." The words struck deep, heavy and freeing all at once. For the first time in weeks, Leona felt seen, not as a scandal, not as a liar, but as a mother holding her child against the storm. That evening, she followed Ruth to the food pantry. The shelves were lined with cans, the walls hung with photographs of families who had come seeking help and left with dignity intact. Ruth introduced her to volunteers, to other mothers who smiled at Elias without suspicion. For a moment, the weight on Leona's shoulders lifted. "You're not alone," Ruth said firmly, as though she could sense the doubt still clouding Leona's mind. "Remember that." That night, Leona sat by the crib and opened her notebook again. The pen moved steadier now. "Elias, today someone looked at you and didn't question your worth. She said your eyes were rare, strong, undeniable. I believe her. And I promise you this, I will not let silence define you. We will not hide. Not anymore." Across town, Ezra stood in a private dining room, surrounded by officials and benefactors. His laughter rang hollow, his uniform polished, his glass always half full. To them, he looked untouchable, the hero they admired. But beneath the table, his foot tapped restlessly. He couldn't stop seeing Elias's face, those storm-gray eyes staring at him across the hospital ward. At one point, a general leaned across the table. "Ezra, you seem distracted. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Ezra lied, flashing the smile he had perfected over decades, the kind of smile that painted cracks as strength. But later, in the privacy of his apartment, he poured whiskey into a glass and left it untouched. He walked to the window, staring out at the skyline that glittered like a battlefield. The city moved below him, indifferent to his doubt. His father's words echoed again. "Never show weakness. Weakness makes you pray." Ezra gripped the sill, jaw tight. But what if weakness wasn't doubt? What if denial was? Meanwhile, Leona's world kept pressing forward. She worked double shifts at the diner, her body aching but her spirit steadier. The whispers didn't vanish, but they no longer bent her spine. Ruth checked in often, bringing food, reminding her that dignity was not something a man in uniform could erase. One evening, after wiping down counters at the diner, Leona overheard two teenagers laughing near the entrance. "That's her," one said. "The nurse who says her kid's his. Imagine thinking a man like Ezra Kane would even look at someone like her." Their laughter stung, sharp as glass, but Leona kept walking. She had learned not to fight with words. Her fight was survival. Her weapon was love. Back home, she sat by Elias's crib and whispered fiercely, "You will never be his secret. You will never be his shame. You are my truth." But across the city, Ezra's doubts deepened. In the silence of his study, he opened an old photograph of himself as a child. He saw the same eyes, storm gray and unyielding, staring back at him from decades past. For the first time in years, he felt hunted, not by enemies, but by truth. And on a quiet night, when Leona finally drifted into exhausted sleep, a car idled outside her apartment building, its headlights dimmed, its engine humming low. Ezra sat in the driver's seat, hands gripping the wheel, staring at the faint light in her window. He imagined Elias inside, being rocked to sleep by a lullaby Ezra had never known. He wanted to step out, to knock, to see the child again. But fear anchored him. At last he drove away, tires hissing against the wet pavement. Inside, unaware of the car that had lingered, Leona stirred and kissed her son's brow. "One day," she whispered, "the truth will be too loud for him to ignore." And far off in the darkness, Ezra whispered to the night, "Why can't I stop seeing him?" The question hung heavy, unanswered, as the storm gathered quietly between them. Spring pushed its way into the city with reluctant warmth. In the narrow apartment on East Grove, light filtered through thin curtains, catching dust in the air like suspended stars. Elias had learned to smile, a crooked little grin that unraveled Leona's exhaustion each time it appeared. His laughter filled the rooms that had once felt heavy with silence. One Saturday morning, Marisol arrived with a bag of groceries balanced against her hip. She scooped Elias into her arms with practiced ease, humming to him as though he were her own. Leona smiled, despite herself. The sight of them together made her reach for her phone, a reflex she almost resisted. But she didn't. She lifted it, caught a photo in the morning light. Elias's storm-gray eyes wide and bright, his tiny hand clutched around Marisol's collar. She hadn't planned to share it. But later that afternoon, Ruth called to check in, and Leona sent the picture with a short message. "He's well today. Thank you for everything." Ruth, proud as if the boy were kin, showed it to one of the pantry volunteers. That volunteer posted it on a small community page online. Within hours, it began to spread, passed from neighbor to neighbor, stranger to stranger. By Sunday evening, the photo had gathered dozens of comments. "Beautiful boy. Look at those eyes. Strong little one." Leona didn't know. She had tucked her phone away and fallen asleep in the rocking chair, Elias curled against her chest. But across the city, Ezra's driver scrolled through news on his tablet while waiting outside a luncheon. His thumb froze, then he glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir," he said hesitantly, "you may want to see this." Ezra took the device without interest, then stopped cold. The photograph glowed against the glass. Elias, smiling in sunlight, those storm-gray eyes gleaming like shards of his own reflection. Ezra's breath caught. He zoomed in, staring until the edges blurred. The resemblance was unmistakable. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he shoved the tablet back into the driver's hands. "Just drive." That night, instead of celebrating a successful speech, Ezra sat alone in his apartment. The whiskey glass on the table remained untouched. The photo replayed in his mind like a ghost. Doubt no longer whispered. It shouted. Meanwhile, Leona carried on unaware. She walked to the diner Monday morning with Elias bundled against her. The regulars greeted her with nods, the cook barked orders, and she slipped back into routine. But by midday, a coworker showed her a phone screen, eyes wide. "Is this your baby?" she asked. Leona blinked at the photo, then at the thread beneath it. Dozens of strangers, speculating, admiring, questioning. Her stomach twisted. She hadn't posted it. She hadn't wanted attention. Yet here it was, Elias's truth, loose in the world. She shoved the phone back. "I need to finish my shift." But her hands shook as she poured coffee, her mind racing. That afternoon, she wheeled Elias to the clinic for his checkup. The waiting room buzzed with coughs and restless children. Ruth was there, helping distribute flyers for the pantry. She caught sight of Leona and smiled knowingly. "The photo," Ruth said softly. "I didn't post it," Leona whispered. "But it's out there now. Everyone's talking." Ruth nodded. "Then let them." Sometimes truth needs a push into the light. Before Leona could answer, the room hushed. The door opened, and Ezra Kane stepped inside. For a heartbeat, Leona froze. The sight of him in full uniform, medals glinting under the harsh lights, filled the space like a storm breaking overhead. 2 security aides hovered behind him, but Ezra lifted a hand to silence them. His gaze swept the room, cold and searching, until it landed on her. "Leona," he said, voice low but heavy with command. Every eye turned toward them. Ruth stepped forward, protective, but Leona raised a hand to stop her. Her pulse thundered. "What are you doing here?" she asked. Ezra's eyes flicked to the stroller beside her. Elias blinked up at him, wide-eyed and curious. For a second, Ezra faltered. His jaw tightened, his breath catching. But then he masked it with steel. "I saw the photo," he said. "You need to stop putting him online." "I didn't put him anywhere," Leona snapped. Her voice was sharper than she expected. "And why does it matter to you, if he isn't yours?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Ezra stiffened, aware of the audience. "Because lies spread fast. You're trying to destroy me." Leona rose, her voice trembling but fierce. "Destroy you? You did that yourself. You denied him." "You denied me. And now the world sees what you refuse to face." Gasps rippled through the waiting room. Ezra's aides shifted uneasily, but he lifted a hand, silencing them again. His eyes locked on Elias. The boy cooed softly, storm-gray eyes wide and unblinking. Ezra swallowed. For a long, unbearable silence, he said nothing. Then, barely audible, he muttered, "This isn't over." He turned sharply, his boots striking hard against the floor as he strode out. The door swung shut behind him, leaving whispers and stares in his wake. Leona sank back into her chair, trembling. Ruth's hand pressed steady on her shoulder. "Child," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Did you see it?" He looked at that boy and couldn't hide it. Doubt rattles even the strongest armor. Leona exhaled, tears blurring her vision. "But he still left." "He left with doubt in his pocket," Ruth said. "And doubt, when planted in stone, can crack it wide open." That night, Leona lay awake, Elias asleep beside her. She replayed the moment in the clinic, the way Ezra's eyes had softened before he buried them under steel. It terrified her as much as it strengthened her. She knew he would come again, and next time the storm would not leave quietly. Across the city, Ezra sat in the dark, the photo glowing on his phone screen. He zoomed in again and again, Elias's face staring back. His hands trembled as he whispered into the silence, "Why can't I stop seeing him?" And though the city hummed outside, in both their hearts, the storm gathered closer. By the following week, the city buzzed with a different kind of energy. The photograph of Elias had not faded as quickly as rumors usually did. Instead, it spread wider, amplified by the whispers that Ezra Kane himself had appeared at a community clinic, his gaze locked on the child before walking away in silence. Leona felt the change before she read it in headlines. Strangers watched her more openly now, not with curiosity but with judgment sharpened to a point. At the diner, 2 women in pressed suits whispered loud enough for her to hear. "That's her, the one from the story." "Poor thing," the other murmured. "Or clever. Hard to tell." Leona's stomach twisted, but she carried their plates with steady hands. Elias needed stability, not a mother unraveling in front of strangers. She tucked her chin, let the gossip brush over her skin like cold wind, and kept moving. That evening, back in the apartment, she sat at the table while Elias cooed from his crib. She opened her notebook and wrote, "They saw you today, my son. They stared as if your truth was a performance. But you are not a stage. You are not a weapon. You are not leverage against a man's pride. You are mine, and I will fight so you never doubt it." When she closed the notebook, she noticed Ruth at the doorway. The older woman had come by with a bag of rice and beans, her presence as steady as the ticking clock. She glanced at the notebook, then at Leona. "You're writing for him again." Leona nodded. "If he grows up hearing nothing but whispers, at least he'll have these pages." Ruth laid the groceries on the counter. "Words matter, child, but so does voice. Don't forget yours." Across town, Ezra sat in his office, the city glittering beneath him like 1,000 eyes. His lawyer, Mason Reed, paced the floor, agitation sharp in his voice. "This is spiraling. The photo, the clinic. You should have walked away quietly, but instead you gave them a spectacle. If she speaks to the press—" "She won't," Ezra interrupted, though doubt hollowed his words. "You don't know that." Mason slapped a folder onto the desk. "I've prepared a strategy. File for defamation. Question her mental state. Dig up anything from her past. A single mother from a forgotten neighborhood against a decorated officer? The court of public opinion will lean our way if we push hard enough." Ezra stared at the folder, his chest tight. It was the logical move, the kind of tactic his father would have demanded: crush the opposition, bury the truth before it grew teeth. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Elias again, storm-gray eyes blinking up at him, steady and undeniable. He shoved the folder back. "Not yet." Mason's expression twisted. "You're hesitating, and hesitation costs reputations. Decide soon, Ezra, before she does." When Mason left, Ezra remained by the window, the silence of the office pressing against his chest. He whispered to the glass, "What am I afraid of? The truth or myself?" Meanwhile, Leona found herself facing her own decision. Late one night, after Elias finally slept, she pulled a card from her drawer. It had been slipped into her apron weeks earlier by a woman at the diner, an investigative journalist offering to listen. Leona had shoved it away, too afraid of Ezra's reach. But now, staring at the simple black letters, her hand trembled. She picked up her phone, typed out a draft email, then deleted it. She couldn't risk Elias becoming a headline, couldn't risk his face plastered across screens for people to dissect like evidence. Yet silence no longer felt like safety. It felt like surrender. The next morning, the choice pressed harder. On her way to the clinic, a man outside the corner store muttered as she passed, "Liar." Another spat near her feet. But a woman behind them, holding her daughter's hand, spoke louder. "Leave her be. She's stronger than you'll ever be." Leona turned, startled. The woman met her gaze with a small nod before walking away. It was nothing, a passing moment. Yet it lit something in her chest, a spark, small but steady. She was not entirely alone. That evening, Ruth stopped by again carrying a bundle of clothes for Elias. Leona hesitated, then asked, "What if I spoke? What if I told the truth out loud instead of just writing it down?" Ruth studied her. The storm would grow louder, but storms also clear skies. The question is whether you're ready to stand in the rain. Leona glanced at Elias, who kicked happily in his crib, his laughter filling the room. "If it's for him," she whispered, "then I'll stand." Across the city, Ezra's world began to tremble. Reporters lingered outside his office, questions shouted at every turn. "Is the child yours? Did you deny him? Why did you appear at the clinic?" He answered none of them. Silence had once been his weapon. Now it felt like chains tightening with each passing day. Late one night, he drove again to East Grove, parking in the shadows outside Leona's building. He sat with the engine off, staring at the window where a dim light glowed. He imagined Elias inside, asleep in the crib. Leona bent over him with unyielding tenderness. For the first time in years, Ezra felt powerless, not against an enemy, but against truth itself. He reached for the door handle, then froze. Fear gripped him, not of her, but of himself, of what admitting the truth would unravel in the life he had built on denial. His hand trembled. Then he let go, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Inside, Leona stirred from the rocking chair, sensing something she couldn't name. She rose, looked through the curtain into the dark street, but saw nothing. Still, her heart quickened, as though the storm outside had drawn closer. And in the silence that stretched between them, two truths lingered. Hers, spoken only to pages and whispers, and his, buried beneath armor already cracking. The diner no longer felt like refuge. It had become a stage. By late March, the booths were filled not just with regulars, but with strangers pretending to sip coffee while watching Leona's every move. She could feel the weight of their eyes even when she turned her back. On Tuesday morning, two men in pressed suits ordered pie they never touched. One slipped a recorder onto the table, subtle but visible enough to send a chill down her spine. When she set down their plates, he smiled. "Miss Hart," he said softly, "would you like to tell your side before someone else tells it for you?" Her breath caught. The question hung in the air like a trap. She shook her head, whispered, "I'm working," and walked away. But the words clung to her like smoke. Tell your side. The choice that had haunted her for months now stalked her at work, at the market, on the walk home. Silence was no longer an escape. That evening, Ruth sat at the table in her apartment while Elias gurgled happily in Marisol's lap. Leona told them about the men, about the recorder. Her voice shook with exhaustion. "They want me to speak, but if I do, he'll bury me. He has the power, the money, the name." Ruth's eyes held steady fire. "He also has cracks. We saw them at the clinic. The more he denies, the louder the truth echoes. Men like him fall hardest when the weight comes from inside." Marisol nodded, rocking Elias gently. "Mija, silence was your shield, but now it's a cage. You have to choose which is heavier, his shadow or your own fear." Leona stared at Elias, at those storm-gray eyes that seemed to study the world with impossible depth. She bent forward, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "If I speak for you." Across the city, Ezra faced his own unraveling. He sat in a press conference hall, cameras flashing like artillery fire. Mason stood at his side, feeding him prepared lines. No comment. Irrelevant. Baseless. Ezra repeated them, each word tasting like ash. Then a reporter shouted from the back, "Colonel Kane, did you or did you not appear at St. Vincent's clinic to confront Leona Hart and her child?" The room fell silent. Ezra's throat tightened. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He saw the flash of Elias's eyes in his mind, gray and steady, piercing the armor he wore. For a second too long, he hesitated. Click. The cameras captured it. Hesitation frozen into image, denial turning to doubt before a city that fed on weakness. Mason leaned close, hissing, "Answer." Ezra swallowed, forced the steel back into his voice. "I was there, but not for her, not for the child. I was there to end lies. That's all." The words rang hollow. Reporters scribbled faster, eyes gleaming. Doubt had escaped into the open, and no denial could cage it again. That night, Ezra slammed his fist against the wall of his apartment, pain shooting up his arm. The whiskey bottle lay untouched on the counter. He couldn't drink away the storm this time. He paced, restless, his father's voice rattling in his head. "Weakness makes you pray." But another voice, quieter, stronger, rose beneath it. Leona's voice at the clinic, steady and sharp. You saw him. You know what you saw. Meanwhile, Leona opened her notebook again. This time she didn't write only to Elias. She wrote to the world she had avoided. Her hand trembled, but the words came steady. My name is Leona Hart. I have stayed silent because silence felt safer. But silence has allowed lies to grow. I am not ashamed of my child. He was born from a night when a decorated officer laid down his medals and showed his loneliness. He has storm-gray eyes that cannot be erased. I will not let him grow up doubting himself because his father feared the truth. She closed the notebook, chest heaving. It wasn't yet public, not yet spoken aloud. But the words existed. That was the first step. The next morning, she carried Elias to the market. People stared as always, but one woman stopped her near the bread stall. I saw the photo, she said softly. He's beautiful. Don't let them shame you. Leona's throat tightened. She nodded, whispered thanks, and walked on. But inside, something shifted. For every whisper of liar, there was now a whisper of belief. The scales were changing. That evening, she drafted a letter to the journalist whose card still waited in her drawer. She didn't send it. Not yet. But it sat in her outbox, ready. For the first time, she felt the balance tilt. Fear still clawed at her ribs, but resolve stood taller. Across town, Ezra faced his own mirror. He stood before it in his uniform, medals gleaming, his reflection immaculate. But when he lifted his gaze, he didn't see the officer the world revered. He saw Elias's storm-gray eyes staring back from his own. He gripped the sink, his knuckles white. He whispered to the empty room, "How much longer can I deny what I can't unsee?" Outside, the storm gathered, rumors swelling, questions multiplying, silence cracking. And in two small apartments on opposite sides of the city, both Leona and Ezra knew the same truth. The collision they had avoided could no longer be delayed. By early April, the city pulsed with tension that felt almost electric. Newspapers no longer buried Leona's story in the back pages. It spread across front covers, headlines sharpened like blades. The denial of a hero? Storm-gray eyes? Coincidence or bloodline? The photograph of Elias had been printed, pixelated, dissected until his small face became a symbol larger than the child himself. Leona read none of it. She refused. But whispers reached her anyway. Snippets at the diner, murmurs at the clinic, strangers glancing at her with a mix of pity and awe. Silence had protected her once. Now it made her complicit in her own erasure. On a Monday afternoon, she arrived at the food pantry to find a crowd gathered outside. Reporters swarmed, cameras flashing as though the brick building had become a battlefield. Ruth stood firm at the door, her body a barrier. "No questions inside," she barked. But the crowd surged louder until Leona appeared, Elias cradled against her chest. The flash of cameras blinded her. Voices rose all at once. "Miss Hart, is it true? Do you deny Colonel Kane? Are you using the child for attention?" The noise pressed in, hot and merciless. Elias whimpered, burying his face into her shoulder. Something inside her cracked. For months she had swallowed silence, but now the world demanded sound. She lifted her chin, her voice clear and steady. "This child is not a scandal. He is not a lie. He is not shame." The words cut through the chaos. The crowd stilled, the air vibrating with the weight of her defiance. She held Elias higher, his storm-gray eyes catching the sunlight. "He is my truth," she continued. "And truth does not disappear just because a man in uniform is afraid to face it." The murmurs exploded into shouts, cameras snapping furiously. Ruth pulled her quickly inside, slamming the door against the storm. Leona's body shook, adrenaline burning through her veins, but her chest felt lighter. For the first time, she had spoken not to pages, not to walls, but to the world. That evening, the clip spread across every channel. Anchors replayed her words, dissecting them, weighing their impact. Some painted her as brave, others as reckless, but no one ignored her anymore. Silence had shattered. Across the city, Ezra watched from the shadows of his office. The screen replayed Leona's face, her voice unwavering, her son's eyes gleaming like his own. Ezra's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. Mason stormed in, livid. "She's gone public. We need to strike back now. Legal action, defamation suits, character assassination. If we don't, you lose everything." But Ezra couldn't look away from the screen. Her words echoed in his skull, louder than Mason's rage. "He is my truth." "Ezra!" Mason snapped. "Decide!" Ezra rose abruptly, fists clenched. "Get out!" Mason froze, stunned. "What?" "I said, get out!" Ezra's voice thundered with command. Mason hesitated, then gathered his papers and left, muttering under his breath. The door slammed. Alone, Ezra pressed his hands to his face. For decades, he had commanded armies, silenced opponents, carved authority into stone. Yet one woman's voice, soft, steady, unarmed, had cracked him wider than any battlefield ever could. That night, Ezra returned to his father's house, a mansion lined with portraits of generations in uniform. The old man sat in a leather chair, eyes sharp despite his age. "You've let this go too far," he growled. "End it. Crush her." Ezra's jaw tightened. "And if I can't?" His father's lip curled. "Then you're not my son." The words landed like a final blow. Ezra staggered under them, but for once, he did not bow. He turned and left, the slam of the door echoing down the marble hall. Meanwhile, Leona sat in her apartment, Elias asleep in her arms. The world outside buzzed with her words, but inside the room, it was only her heartbeat and his steady breathing. She rocked him gently, whispering, "I spoke for you, and I'll keep speaking until no one can deny you." But even as resolve burned in her chest, fear lingered at the edges. Ezra was powerful, unpredictable. Her words had freed her, but they had also provoked him. The storm had broken open, and storms never ended without destruction. The next morning, Ezra stood before the mirror again. His reflection stared back, medals gleaming, uniform immaculate. But beneath the surface, cracks spread like fractures in glass. He leaned forward, whispering to the face that no longer looked like his own. "How long before truth devours me?" Behind him, the television replayed Leona's words once more. The sound filled the empty room, her voice carrying into the silence he could no longer command. And though miles apart, Leona and Ezra felt the same inevitability tighten around them. The collision could no longer be delayed. The next time they stood in the same room, the world itself would be watching. The courthouse steps swarmed with voices, a sea of microphones and cameras pointed like rifles. Leona climbed the stone stairs with Elias balanced on her hip, Ruth steady at her side. The air reeked of rain and sweat, heavy with expectation. This was no longer whispers in diners or gossip at church pews. This was judgment-made spectacle. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a different electricity, tighter, hushed, like a storm contained by four walls. Ezra sat across the aisle, his uniform pressed, medals shining like armor. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked, restless, toward the boy who would not stop staring back at him. The judge entered, gavel striking. Silence fell. Words filled the room, motions, objections, procedures that blurred into noise. Leona sat rigid, fingers digging into her skirt, heart pounding to the rhythm of Elias's small breaths. Every nerve screamed at her to flee, but she stayed. She had promised herself she would see this through, no matter how much it cost. Then came the test. Simple, clinical, a swab brushed across Elias's cheek, another taken from Ezra. The samples sealed in sterile envelopes, passed to waiting hands. Quick, almost too quick, considering the weight they carried. The waiting stretched into hours. Outside, reporters speculated. Inside, silence deepened until it felt like the room itself might crack. Ruth whispered prayers under her breath. Ezra sat stone still, except for the twitch in his jaw. Leona held Elias tighter, whispering into his hair, "No matter what they say, you are mine." When the clerk returned with the results, the air snapped taut. A paper rustled, a throat cleared, then the words landed like iron. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scrambled for phones. Ruth squeezed Leona's hand so hard it ached. Leona's breath caught, tears springing hot and unbidden. She kissed Elias's head, whispering, "They can't deny you anymore." Across the aisle, Ezra flinched as though struck. For months he had built his denial into a fortress. Now it collapsed in a single line of ink. His shoulders sagged, the medals on his chest suddenly heavy as chains. He rose slowly, eyes searching for escape, but finding none. The judge's voice carried through the chaos, firm and unyielding. "Colonel Kane, this court recognizes Elias Hart as your son. Responsibility follows truth." The gavel struck again, sealing it. When the room emptied, Leona lingered. Ezra stood by the bench, staring at the floor. For the first time, he looked less like a man of power and more like a boy cornered by shadows. She approached, Elias perched against her hip. "You can't outrun it now," she said softly. Ezra lifted his gaze. His eyes were raw, red-rimmed. For a long moment, he looked at Elias without speaking. Then his voice broke. "He has my eyes." Leona's chest tightened. "He always did." Ezra reached a hand forward, trembling, but stopped short of touching the boy. His fingers curled into a fist, then dropped to his side. "I don't know how to be what he needs." "Then learn," Leona replied. Her voice carried no softness, only truth. "But if you walk away again, don't come back. He deserves better than half a father." Ezra's throat worked. He nodded once, as if accepting terms of a battle he had already lost. That evening, the news spread like wildfire. Clips of the judge's ruling, photographs of Ezra standing hollow in the courtroom, Leona holding Elias with fierce pride. Some called it justice. Others called it scandal. But no one could pretend it hadn't happened. At the apartment, neighbors knocked softly on Leona's door. Some brought food. Others offered apologies. She accepted their kindness with quiet dignity, but her focus remained on Elias. She sat at the table, pen in hand, writing in the journal that had become her confession, her testament. "Your truth has been spoken," she wrote. "Not because he gave it, but because you carried it in your eyes. The world knows now. But more than that, you will never again wonder if you were wanted. You were always wanted. By me." Across the city, Ezra sat in his stripped office, boxes stacked against the walls. The medals on his desk glinted under dim light. He poured no whiskey. He held no papers. Instead, he stared at the photograph tucked in his pocket. Elias laughing in the park, storm-gray eyes lit with joy. For hours, he sat unmoving, until at last he whispered into the quiet, "My son." The word cracked him open, raw and unguarded. He pressed his hands over his face, tears slipping through fingers hardened by years of command. Days later, he appeared at Leona's door. No cameras trailed him this time. He stood drenched in rain, his hand hesitant on the frame. When she opened it, Elias squealed, reaching toward him. Ezra froze, then stepped inside, his movements halting, unpracticed. He crouched, lowering himself to Elias's level. The boy giggled, pressing a toy into his palm. Ezra's hand shook as he closed around it, as though clutching something fragile for the first time. He looked up at Leona, shame and yearning tangled in his eyes. "I don't deserve forgiveness," he said, "but I want to stay." Leona studied him, heart heavy with memory and hope. "Then prove it." "Not with words, with presence, every day." He nodded, his jaw set not with arrogance, but resolve. That night, as the rain eased outside, Leona rocked Elias to sleep. She glanced toward the man sitting quietly in the corner, stripped of armor, humbled by truth. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder if broken things could be rebuilt, not perfectly, not easily, but piece by piece. She kissed her son's forehead and whispered, "We are not invisible anymore." Outside, the city hummed with gossip and headlines. But inside the small apartment, the storm had given way to something new. Not peace, not yet, but the fragile beginning of it. And in that suspended quiet, where love and doubt shared the same room, the story of 3 lives, once fractured by silence, began to move forward.